In May 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed he had finally broken the British Eighth Army, yet as his Panzer divisions swept across the Libyan sands toward the Gazala Line, they collided with a high-profile silhouette that defied every law of modern tank design. This was the moment the American M3 medium tank, a machine mocked as a three-story disaster by the British and a coffin for 7 brothers by the Soviets, fundamentally rewrote the rules of armored engagement in North Africa. The desolate, windswept expanses of the North African Western Desert had become, by early 1942, a graveyard for British tactical ambition and a proving ground for the revolutionary maneuver warfare perfected by the German Afrika Korps. For 18 agonizing months, the British forces had struggled against a fundamental imbalance in firepower, as their cruiser tanks, while fast and agile, carried the pathetic 2-pounder 40mm gun, which lacked a high-explosive round, and struggled to penetrate the thickening frontal armor of the German Panzer III and Panzer IV. This technical disparity created a recurring nightmare for British tankers, who were forced to charge into the teeth of German anti-tank screens just to get within a suicidal range where their small shells might actually scratch the paint of the enemy, only to find themselves picked off from 1,000 meters away by the high-velocity 50mm guns of Rommel's Panzers. The psychological toll of this equipment inferiority was reaching a breaking point among the crews of the 7th Armored Division, who knew that every time they crested a ridge, they were bringing knives to a gunfight against a commander whose tactical genius was only matched by the superior reach of his weaponry. While the desert sands were being stained by this one-sided slaughter, the United States was undergoing a frantic, almost violent industrial awakening after watching the fall of France in 1940, an event that shattered the American military's complacency and revealed that their current armored force of roughly 400 light tanks was effectively obsolete. American military planners, led by visionaries who realized that the tank was no longer a mere support tool for the infantry, but the decisive arm of the modern battlefield, faced a terrifying reality. They needed a medium tank armed with a 75mm gun immediately, but they lacked the industrial infrastructure to build a rotating turret capable of handling such a massive weapon. The engineering challenge was immense because a 75mm gun generated recoil forces so powerful that they required a turret ring over 60 inches in diameter, a precision machine component that American foundries in 1940 simply could not cast or finish with the necessary accuracy. With the clock ticking and the shadow of global conflict looming ever larger, the engineers at Rock Island Arsenal proposed a desperate, almost archaic compromise that would place the primary 75mm gun in a side-mounted sponson in the hull, effectively creating a tank that looked like a land-bound battleship from a previous century. This design, which would become the M3 medium tank, was born from the cold realization that an ugly, imperfect weapon available now was infinitely more valuable than a perfect tank that would not arrive for another 2 years. As production lines began to roar in August 1941, the sheer scale of American industrial might began to manifest, churning out thousands of these towering steel behemoths that stood 10 feet tall, a height necessitated by the massive Wright Continental radial aircraft engine stuffed into the rear of the hull. The M3 was a mechanical contradiction, featuring a hull-mounted 75mm gun for heavy punch, a 37mm gun and a small upper turret for lighter targets, and a commander's cupola perched on top, creating a 3-tiered structure that looked more like a target than a fighting vehicle. Despite its glaring flaws, including riveted armor that could turn into internal shrapnel when hit by non-penetrating rounds, the M3 represented a massive leap in raw firepower that the Allies desperately needed to stabilize the crumbling front lines in Egypt. By January 1942, the first shipments of these American tanks arrived in the port of Alexandria, where British crews looked upon the towering machines with a mixture of skepticism and hope, quickly modifying the design with a lower-profile turret to house their own radio gear. The British version was christened the Grant, named after the American Civil War general, while the original American configuration was dubbed the Lee. But regardless of the name, the most important feature was the 75mm gun hidden in the right side of the hull. When the British gunners first took these machines to the firing ranges in the Egyptian desert, the skepticism vanished instantly as they realized the 75mm shell could fly further and hit harder than anything they had ever possessed, consistently punching through simulated Panzer armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. For the first time in the North African campaign, the British had a dual-purpose weapon that could not only destroy enemy tanks, but also fire high-explosive rounds to annihilate the deadly German 88mm anti-tank guns and soft-skinned transport vehicles from a safe distance. As Rommel prepared his next great offensive, known as Operation Venezia, his intelligence officers reported the arrival of these strange, tall American vehicles. But the German staff largely dismissed them as clumsy, outdated designs that would be easy prey for the seasoned crews of the Afrika Korps. Rommel, ever the gambler, planned a massive sweeping maneuver around the southern flank of the British Gazala Line, expecting to catch the 8th Army in a disorganized retreat, just as he had done so many times before. He did not know that waiting in the desert heat was the 4th Armored Brigade, now equipped with 167 E-3 Grants, their crews trained and eager to test their new American iron against the legends of the Panzerwaffe. The stage was set for a collision that would fundamentally alter Rommel's perception of American industrial power, as the Iron Cathedral prepared to make its combat debut in one of the most pivotal armored clashes of the war. On the morning of May 27, 1942, the 15th Panzer Division rumbled across the desert floor toward the British positions, their commanders standing high in their hatches, with the supreme confidence of men who had never met an Allied tank they could not outrange. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the dunes, when the first British Grants opened fire from a distance of over 1,200 meters, a range that should have been safely beyond the reach of any British tank gun known to the Germans. The German crews watched in horror as the first shells, far larger and faster than the old 40mm rounds, began to find their marks, turning once invincible Panzer IIIs into pillars of black smoke and twisted metal before the Germans could even see their attackers. The simple math of the engagement had changed overnight. The Grant's 75mm gun could kill a Panzer from 1,000 meters, while the standard German 50mm gun needed to be nearly at point-blank range to penetrate the Grant's thick frontal armor. In the chaos of the shifting sands, the disciplined radio nets of the Afrika Korps dissolved into screams of confusion as veteran commanders reported being destroyed by invisible batteries or heavy artillery that seemed to be moving with the speed of tanks. This was the moment the myth of German equipment superiority began to crack, as Rommel himself received reports that his spearheads were being blunted by a new American tank that tore great holes in his ranks and rendered his existing tactics obsolete. The battle for the Gazala Line would rage for weeks, a brutal war of attrition where the M3 Grant served as a vital shield, holding the line against the Desert Fox's most ferocious assaults and buying the time necessary for the even more capable M4 Sherman to reach the front. While Rommel would eventually win the tactical battle at Gazala through his sheer brilliance and the misuse of British reserves, the cost in irreplaceable German armor was so staggering that the Afrika Korps would never truly recover its offensive momentum. As the dust settled over the burning wreckage of the 15th Panzer Division, the realization of a shifting paradigm began to take hold within the German High Command, forcing Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to confront the terrifying reality that his era of technical dominance had been severed by an American stopgap. The Desert Fox, a man who built his reputation on the razor edge of mobile warfare, found himself staring at intelligence reports that described a machine so tall it could be seen from miles away, yet so powerfully armed that it rendered his most trusted panzers little more than steel targets at 1,000 meters. Faced with the sudden obsolescence of his Panzer III and IV tanks, Rommel demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that made him a legend, immediately pivoting his tactical doctrine to rely on the terrifying 88mm anti-aircraft gun as his primary tank-killing instrument. He understood that the M3 Grant's 75mm gun was a game-changer, but he also recognized its fatal flaw. The towering height of 10 feet meant that his observers could track British armored movements across the flat desert floor long before the tanks were in range to fire. Rommel began pushing his 88mm batteries into the very vanguard of his armored spearheads, using them to create a long-range umbrella that could destroy the Iron Cathedrals from 2,000 meters away, well beyond the effective reach of the American 75mm rounds. This tactical evolution turned the desert into a lethal game of cat and mouse, where the British, emboldened by their new firepower, often charged into hidden screens of German anti-tank guns, discovering too late that while they could now kill panzers, they were still vulnerable to the high-velocity sting of the Flak 88. The psychological warfare intensified as German crews, who had previously laughed at the splendid target, now operated with a grim, frantic energy, knowing that the first shot of an engagement was no longer a formality, but a desperate necessity for survival. Rommel's personal journals from this period reveal a deep-seated anxiety regarding American industrial capacity, as he noted with a chilling clarity that the United States had managed to design, manufacture, and deploy an effective medium tank in less than a single year, a feat of mobilization that Germany simply could not match. Beyond the strategic level, the life of a crewman inside the M3 was a relentless assault on the senses. A claustrophobic existence defined by the deafening roar of the 9-cylinder radial engine and the acrid stench of spent shell casings. In the blistering heat of the North African summer, the temperature inside the steel hull could soar to over 120 degrees, turning the tank into a literal oven where men sweated through their overalls in minutes. The driver, seated low in the hull, had to navigate the terrain through a narrow slit, often relying entirely on the voice of the commander, crackling through a primitive radio headset. Soviet tankers, accustomed to the low profile and wide tracks of their legendary T-34, found the M3 to be a vertical monstrosity that invited every German anti-tank gunner for miles to take a shot, leading to the grim nickname, a coffin for 7 brothers. The Soviet crews particularly loathed the riveted construction of the hull. They discovered that even a non-penetrating hit from a German shell could shear the heads off the internal rivets, sending high-velocity steel slugs bouncing around the cramped, fuel-heavy interior of the tank. Inside the steel box, the 7-man crew operated in a chaotic environment of deafening noise and choking fumes, struggling to coordinate the fire of the hull-mounted 75 and the turreted 37mm guns while the massive radial engine thundered behind them. Despite these horrific flaws, the Red Army utilized the M3 out of sheer necessity during the desperate defensive battles of 1942, proving that even a flawed medium tank was superior to the light tanks and infantry support weapons that had failed so catastrophically during the initial German invasion. As the conflict deepened, the M3 became a symbol of the arsenal of democracy, a physical testament to the fact that the United States could produce weapons faster than the Axis could destroy them. In the massive Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, workers who had previously built luxury sedans were now welding armor plate and fitting massive guns, creating a production line that worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This industrial surge was the true nightmare for the German high command, as they realized they weren't just fighting a military, but an entire industrial civilization that had fully committed itself to their total destruction. The logistical nightmare of supporting the M3 across 3 continents required the creation of a massive supply chain that spanned thousands of miles of ocean, vulnerable to U-boat attacks but ultimately inexhaustible. Every M3 required a staggering amount of fuel, spare parts, and ammunition, and the American ability to maintain these machines in the middle of the Libyan desert or the Russian steppe was a feat of engineering and organization that was just as impressive as the tank itself. Just like that, the war of maneuver was being replaced by a war of logistics, where the side with the most steel and the best supply lines would eventually emerge victorious. By late 1942, the tide was turning not just because of the M3's firepower, but because of its reliability. While the advanced German Tiger tanks often broke down after a few hundred miles of travel, the M3's Wright Continental engine could take incredible levels of abuse. British mechanics noted that even with minimal maintenance, the M3 could cross hundreds of miles of abrasive sand and still be ready for combat, a stark contrast to the temperamental Italian and German machinery they had faced for years. This mechanical stamina allowed Montgomery to plan massive, long-range offensives without the constant fear that his armored spearheads would collapse from mechanical failure before reaching their objectives. In the steaming jungles of Burma and the rugged terrain of the Pacific Islands, the M3 found a second life that surprised its most vocal critics, proving that its tiered weaponry was perfectly suited for flushing out Japanese defenders from fortified bunkers. The dual-gun configuration allowed the M3 to engage hidden infantry with machine guns while simultaneously blasting stone and timber fortifications with high-explosive shells from the main hull gun. Immediately, the Japanese troops, who lacked heavy anti-tank weaponry, found themselves defenseless against this iron giant that could traverse terrain they had considered impassable for armor. The tactical paradox of the M3 was most evident when a commander attempted to adopt a hull-down position, a standard defensive maneuver where a tank hides its hull behind a ridge, exposing only its turret. Because the primary 75mm gun was mounted low in the hull sponson, the M3 could not fire its most powerful weapon while remaining protected. It had to crest the ridge entirely, exposing its massive 10-foot-tall silhouette to every German anti-tank gun in the sector. British commanders had to invent entirely new tactical drills to compensate for this design flaw, often using the 37mm turret gun to provide suppressing fire while the driver maneuvered the massive vehicle into a position where the hull gun could finally speak. As the production of the M4 Sherman reached its peak, the M3 was relegated to secondary roles, serving as command vehicles, armored recovery tanks, and specialized bridge layers. Yet its contribution to the final victory remained undeniable. The lessons learned from the M3's rush design and combat experience were directly applied to the development of the Sherman, ensuring that the next generation of American armor would be the most balanced and effective tank of the war. But the M3 had been there when the world was on the brink, a tall, awkward, and unloved warrior that stood its ground when everything seemed lost. The psychological impact on the German soldier was profound. Seeing the iron cathedrals continue to appear in ever greater numbers, despite the best efforts of the Luftwaffe, and the Panzerwaffe broke the morale of even the most battle-hardened veterans. They began to realize that no matter how many British or American tanks they destroyed, 10 more would take their place the following morning, a reality that Rommel himself acknowledged in his private letters as the inevitable weight of American iron. Suddenly, the war was no longer a grand adventure for the German army, but a slow, grinding realization that their technical brilliance was being smothered by sheer volume. The legacy of the M3 is not one of graceful victory, but of gritty, indispensable service during the Allies' darkest hour, acting as the bridge between the humiliating defeats of 1940 and the sweeping triumphs of 1945. Today, when visitors look at an M3 in a museum, they see a relic of a desperate time. Yet it was this very machine that proved the United States could outproduce, out-engineer, and outfight the most experienced armored force in human history. The M3 was the iron cathedral that gave the British the faith to stand their ground, the coffin that held the line on the Volga, and the ugly duckling that eventually gave birth to the Sherman, proving forever that in war, the most beautiful weapon is the one that is there when you need it most. The M3 Grant was often called ugly but available. In your opinion, is it better for a military to have a perfect weapon that arrives late, or a flawed weapon that arrives right when the line is breaking? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.